Every year, 600,000 Americans die from one of the most deadly diseases we know, cancer. Of those 600,000, 35,000 moms, daughters, grandmothers, wives, and even some men, though rare, die from breast cancer. I have lost 3 people to the disease: my partner, my father, and my true love, Debbie Beck, who I reunited with after 30 years. I'm going to share with you what it's like to live with these people and care for these people and watch their life slowly be pulled away. Cancer, as we know, is deadly. There are more treatments becoming available, helping in raising the survivability rate. But there is still a large portion that don't recover. And I have seen this. My partner was the first time I was faced with this disease. He was diagnosed with colon cancer in '89. The surgery was successful. On his follow-up, the doctor had bad news. It had spread to his liver and it was inoperable. Since he was my partner, we talked about the company and what we would do. And I told Larry, you can work as long as you want to, and even when you can't work, I will continue to pay you. This was in March of 1990. He would pass 7 months later. And the most dramatic part was watching this young 45-year-old man have his life sucked out of him. It was horrible. And it left a lasting impression on me, but it helped for what was coming down the road that I couldn't see. I didn't give Larry full-time care. I had my own family. I had our company to run. But I would visit as often as possible. I would repeat this 16 years later. I went broke for a second time. I called my father and asked him if I could move back home and regroup, and he agreed. I knew he had had medical issues, but nothing to really be worried about. I mean, he'd had a stroke when he was 78, but he was still getting around. He still had his faculties. He still had his strength. He just didn't go out as much. And he didn't drive anymore because in one visit to Tulsa, I took his keys away from him. After my mom said it will never happen. But when I explained to him that he could be driving around the neighborhood and kill a 6 or 8-year-old, which could be one of his grandchildren, that got his attention and he changed his mind. We had to go to Oklahoma City for a follow-up. No big deal. But something didn't seem right. Now, Dad had talked about cancer. He had talked about some of his friends that had had the disease and he had lost. And he had always made it very clear he wasn't doing chemo. He wasn't doing radiation. He had lived a full life. And he wanted to continue to live a full life. No one had really informed me what was going on. We go to Oklahoma City. We go into the room. And I start listening to the doctors talk. And something wasn't quite right. They kept looking at his chest. He had sores on his cheeks, of which we were just treating with Neosporin and a gauze. I had no idea what they were about to hit me with, but I was looking in their eyes. And, you've been in the office and they say, yeah, you got this, you got that. You agree, you understand, you say, okay, give me a prescription, and you go home, right? Well, something told me this wasn't right. So my niece and my dad leave the room. And I walk around the halls looking for the doctors. They're standing in their little cubby hole going over their notes. And I interrupt them and say, okay, I need to know what the hell is going on here. And they just looked at me with those shocked eyes of like, excuse me, sir, may we help you? And I said, yes, I need the truth. And I didn't hear that in the room. So you three need to tell me exactly what in the hell is going on with my father. And they glanced at each other and said, did you see the purple marks on his chest? And, they looked like bruises. And there were a few on his neck. I said, yes. They go, that's the cancer. I said, okay. And I always follow up important questions with and. Because people kind of look at me and go, oh, you want to know more? Well, yeah, in this case, I need to know a hell of a lot more. They said, your dad does not want chemotherapy and he doesn't want radiation. I said, yes, I understand that too. Now tell me, again, what is going on? Your father has 7 months to live. Excuse me? He has 7 months to live since he is refusing normal treatments. Okay. I get to think about this from Oklahoma City back to Tulsa. I'd been lied to. No one had even mentioned the hint that Dad had cancer. Well, since I went through it with Larry, I knew what the end of the outcome would be. But I was really in for an education. You hear the story that we are our parents' keepers as they get older. I had the opportunity to do something I hadn't been able to do up until this day. Spend quality time with my father. Yeah, I had to go broke for this to happen. My dad and I got 7 months together that can never be replaced. And it was quality time. Even though he couldn't do all the things that he was able to do, to sit on the back porch and talk to him and have him tell me stories that we never talked about because we didn't have the time, or there were the kids, or there were the bills. You've all been there. It's like the Cat Stevens song, Cat in a Cradle. There's a lot of truth to that song. And I got to see it, and I got to do something I was not trained for, I wasn't prepared for, but accepted it. I got to take care of my father. And I loved every minute of it. He was lucid. He had all of his faculties up until a week before the cancer had finally taken over and was rapidly draining his energy. But up until that final week, the chats that we had on the porch were just phenomenal. The stories that he told me, and there's two in particular. We were sitting on the back porch, and I asked Dad, of all the girls I dated, of all, and my wife, who was his favorite? I mean, and he didn't flinch. He said, Debbie. And I was like, really? Debbie was my high school sweetheart. He was just dead set. I mean, it was Debbie. It's like, it wasn't Vita, it wasn't Sharon, it wasn't Betsy. He said, no, it was Debbie. I said, well, what was so special about her? He goes, I don't know, but she is the one I really liked. And son, you remember years ago when you backed into some guy at Wendy's? And I'm like, excuse me? He goes, yeah, didn't you have an accident with Debbie in the truck and kind of backed into this guy? And I was like, how the hell does he know about this? I never told him this. Well, my best friend was Mike Paling. Well, the Palings and my parents were good friends. In fact, I went over about a week after I backed into this guy, and Mr. Paling made his own fishing rods. So walking into the house and seeing them sitting in his chair with his iced tea, threading on a new eye hole, was no big deal. And he looks at me and he goes, well, how are you tonight, Jeff? And I said, well, I'm pretty good. And he sets his pole down, he takes a drink of tea, and he goes, do you know a guy by the name of, and I forgot his name, so we'll just say Red Smith? And it's like, no. You're sure about that? I'm like, yes. Well, that's kind of interesting because Monday morning, Red came in and said there was this high school teenager who backed into him at Wendy's in a red F-100 and for whatever reason wasn't able to get out of his truck to view the damage. And I'm not going to tell you why I couldn't get out of my truck, but we're both teenagers and we were frisky, and I'll let your mind go from there. And I was like, oh shit, he knows. Oh no, he knows. Well, I thought that story was done and over. Now here's my father 30 years later, 35 years later, relating the same story to me. And I'm like, oh damn. And of course, once again, I am denying the fact that this incident even happened. And he said, no, son. Bill Paling called me and told me all about it. And I was like, oh, damn. So you've known about this all these years and never bothered bringing it up? Son, I was just waiting for the right moment. And this is the right moment. And these are the stories that we shared. He talked about his service in the Army. He talked about courting mom. In fact, when I cleaned out the garage, I found all the love letters that he wrote her when he was in the Army. Mom had forgotten all about him. It was just one big shoebox that I took in the house and gave to Mom. But taking care of Dad was just, it was an honor. When they assigned a hospice nurse for him, I did with her what I did with the doctors. We went outside to where my mother couldn't hear. I said, okay, I need to hear the worst case scenario so we're prepared. And she said, make sure you have a lot of black plastic. It's like, black plastic? What the hell for? She goes, his cancer, it's all in his chest and it's moving up. It's coming up his neck. And in a worst case scenario, it can break the veins in the neck and push them out of the skin to where blood will be going all over the place. I said, well, that's a pretty disgusting description. She goes, you wanted the truth? And I said, yes, I do. She goes, make sure you have that because it does happen. It's rare, but it does happen. Just be ready for the worst. Monitor his pain if he has any. His medications, we're going to go through those because obviously he doesn't need these anymore. He does have about 7 months. And just be aware of what's going on. Keep treating the wounds on his neck and his face, and he should be good. And he was. He was comfortable. He got to watch his sports. Was it draining taking care of him? Absolutely. I mean, I'm in construction, and I thought pouring 600 or 700 yards of concrete a day was hard work. When you become a caregiver, it is a whole different ballgame, especially if you're not trained. There wasn't anybody to call. There was a house that needed repairs done. There were so many, damn it, there were so many chores and projects that my young son and I did to get the house in shape, get it ready for the eventual day because Dad would pass. Mom's in her 80s. She's not going to be able to live there any longer. And yeah, I was exhausted a lot. I had to get out of the house every once in a while just to get a break, even if it was going to the park and smoking a cigarette or two. I realized I was mentally and physically exhausted. There were times I'd lay on the bed in my old bedroom and I'd hide the remote because that's where Dad came to watch TV because he was deaf, and even with his headphones on like mine, you couldn't sleep because the volume's cranked all the way up, and it's like, ah! But I would do it again. I love taking care of my father. Yes, the cancer was deadly, but as I mentioned, up until his last week, which was about February 8th of 2005, he was still taking care of himself. Yes, I had to help him and the nurse when we gave him a bath. My niece and I would change him. We would clean him. We would dress him. You don't think about that when you look at your parents. Well, if you love them enough, it's not going to bother you at all. It's just something that needs to be done. These are the people that took care of you as you grew up. Now it is your time to help them, and that is what I loved. I got to help my father. I watched him through the years help all types of people. He didn't care. He was big and involved in the church. If there was a disaster and somebody needed to collect supplies and drive them to where a tornado had hit, Dad was first in line. If he was in town, he would help. This is what he did. Now I got to repay him for all of his kindness and love. And that cannot be replaced. As I said, it is physically and mentally draining. And when his last week happened, he was watching an OSU basketball game. I think OSU won. It really didn't matter. He stood up and immediately fell over, just like that. I called my son because Dad had fallen before. We both got him up. I called for Sean and I said, "Come help me, Dad's fallen." When I looked into his eyes, the twinkle that had been there for so many decades was gone. I don't know where the cancer hit him, if it was in his brain, if it was in his neck and his blood supply, but you could tell it was gone. I called the hospice nurse the next day. I explained what I had seen, what he was like, and she said he has 1 week. Okay? They made preparations. They got a hospital bed into the house. And we took it a day at a time. Now came the interesting part. I was asleep, trying to catch up on some lost rest. My niece comes into the room and says, Granddad won't let me change him. It's like, why? Why are you waking me up? Well, he says there's people in the room. Okay. My mom thinks he's hallucinating. My niece doesn't know what to do. And I'm a man of logic. I said, okay, let's see what's going on. I go into the room, and you can feel there's this energy force in there. I kind of looked around because I know there's nobody else in there. I said, Dad, I understand you're in some deep discussion with some of your friends. Jeffrey, I am having a wonderful conversation with my friends. I said, okay, well, here's the deal, Dad. We need to change you. So I need you to tell your friends to give us 15 minutes, turn around so you have your privacy. We'll do what we have to do, and when we leave, then you can go back to your conversation. And he said, well, I think that's a pretty good idea, son. Folks, give me about 15 and I'll be back. That's what he said. So we did our thing. We cleaned him up. We changed him. We gave him his medication, and we left. And my niece and my mother are still convinced that he's hallucinating. I just looked at them and said, did you not feel the energy in that room? There were beings in there with him. They are making ready for Ralph to join them. And they looked at me like I was nuts, which sometimes is true, not in this case. You could feel the energy and the power in that room. Sadly, he did pass, but he passed in peace on my oldest son's birthday, a day he will never forget. Now, in this story, I mentioned Debbie, right? Well, Debbie's the third one that I lost to cancer. We dated in high school, and then we got back together in January of 2009. And she told me that she had had a mastectomy in May. She had finished her chemo. She still had the port in her chest, and she was on the tail end of radiation treatment. And she had no hair, and she was divorced, and she had children, and I said, I don't care. I waited 30 years to see you, so let's see if there's something still there. So I know this time, unlike with Larry and Dad, she has battled it, and it looks like she's beaten it. But there's something in the back of my mind saying, if you think the last two were challenging, you're going to love this one. So without getting into the real love story portion of this, I know she has breast cancer. And for the first 3 months, there's no problems. She's finished her radiation treatment, but have you ever been with anybody who's had radiation treatment? I never could understand why she slept so much. She was a pharmacist at Walmart, and they worked 4 days on and 4 days off. And when I would talk to her on the phone, and she told me she was going on for radiation treatment, I wouldn't hear from her for, say, a day and a half, 2 days. And you could just hear in her voice how tired she was. Well, I decided I'm going to be in town for one of these treatments. I need to see what's going on because Larry and Dad didn't go through that. And I took her to the appointment. I was in the waiting room talking to a guy who was being treated for prostate cancer, and I explained to him what was going on. And what a great old man, just an old country farmer from McAllister, Oklahoma. And all he said was, "Son, take care of her." And I said, "Yes, sir. It is my honor to take care of Debbie." And she comes out of that treatment room. She can barely stand. Have you seen this before? Have you gone to a session with anybody who's had radiation treatment? I physically carried her out of that office and put her in my truck. She had zero strength. I'd never seen this before. This really shocked me, and it's like, okay, she's going to go home and she's going to go to sleep. Now I know how devastating and draining this treatment can be and why my father did not want to go through it. Because, yeah, there's a lot of truth to the cure can be worse than the disease. I walked her back into her house. She laid on the couch and she slept for 18 hours. That was just eye-opening to me. She didn't have the strength to go up the stairs, and that's why she slept on the couch. So the girls and I took care of her. We took care of each other. We continued to live our lives until she woke up. And when she got enough sleep, she'd wake up, and now we got to do everything. In March or April, she had a follow-up. They had done a blood sample or culture, I'm not sure what the test was, and it looked like the cancer might be back because the numbers were, I think they said 25, 26. Don't quote me on this. But they wanted to do an MRI. And I told Debbie, I'll be there for this one. So we took her to her appointment. They did the MRI and said they'd have the results in, I think, 3 to 5 days. Okay? Debbie, I'll be back. I will be here for this appointment. She goes, are you sure? And I said, yeah, I'm positive I will be here. I go to work 5 days. I come back, drive her to her appointment. The oncologist doctor is there who did the mastectomy and monitored her chemo and her radiation treatment. And have you ever had somebody read you a death sentence before? Up until that day, I'd never heard one. It's in your spine. It's wrapped around your vertebrae. It's encircled your heart. And half of your liver is covered in the cancer. And here are the drugs that we're going to use to combat it. And this list went on and on and on. And these are the drugs we'll have to administer to counter the effects of the drugs that are going to kill the disease. And he ran off 3 or 5. And I just shook my head. Debbie was just now regaining her strength, and she was eating good and had that twinkle in her eyes, and her beautiful smile had returned. Her hair had just started growing out again. And all I'm thinking is, the cure is going to kill her. She doesn't have the strength to fight this again. And that wasn't being negative. And of course, tears are pouring down her eyes. And I looked him straight in the eye as he was saying this, just like I did with my dad's doctors. And I saw the same look. She's terminal. Well, now our girls have to know about this. So how are you going to tell your loves daughters that their mother's going to die? Yeah, that weighed heavily on my mind as we headed home. We got to the house. The girls knew that she had this appointment. And folks, this is where you have to be honest with children. They're not stupid. Jessica was 14. Amanda was 11. So they're old enough to understand what life is all about. Debbie walked into the house. Jessica came and met me. And how do you lie to a 14-year-old that asks, what'd the doctor say? How would you answer that question? And I looked at her and I said, do you want the truth or do you want me to lie? She goes, I am tired of people lying to me. I need the truth. Okay? Barring a miracle, your mother is going to die. I said, okay, that's what I need to know. I said, now do you want me to tell Amanda? She goes, no, I'll tell her. That was tough. But she appreciated being honest. You must be honest with people. Don't hide it. Don't sweep it under the rug, because that's just going to make a bad situation worse when the disease really kicks in and starts sapping their strength. Our lifestyle didn't change. We continued to do everything that we could. Now with Debbie, unlike my father and partner, it was slowly sapping her strength. You could see a little bit of it each week. It wasn't really noticeable until Memorial Day weekend. I bought tickets for us to go to a Ranger game, and it was a perfect day. Probably in the low 80s, a little bit of wind, beautiful blue sky. We were sitting on the first base line, 15 rows up, great seats. And as the game progressed, I could see her getting a little tired, but she didn't say anything. She had a few cold drinks and some water. But when the game was over, the sun, of which she loved to suntan, had now become her enemy. My oldest son, Justin, and I had to walk her out of the stadium back to the truck, which was probably a half mile away, quarter to a half mile. And with each step, she got weaker and weaker. The minute we got in the truck, I turned on the air conditioner. She had to get cooled off and get cooled off fast. That was the day I realized how much it was sapping away her energy. Even her girls noticed it. And up until then, we knew she had it. We knew treatment was going to start in probably the first part of June, according to what the doctor said. That was tough to watch. just like the radiation therapy. This is how draining this disease is. It's devastating. Her condition continued to worsen as the cancer progressed and she was losing her strength, but we continued to live life. Her girls knew what was coming. I knew what was coming, but this was not the topic of discussion. The topic of discussion was enjoying the time that we have left and not the time that we won't be able to spend. On July 4th, somehow she was able to bring herself downstairs and shoot off some fireworks with me and her girls. But it was a Herculean effort on her part to come outside. I could see it. And I went over by her side and put my arm around her and held her up. On July 15th, I got a phone call from her oldest daughter that she had blood coming out of her mouth. And I said, okay, well, I can't be there today, but I can be there tomorrow. So you might be wondering, why am I not there that day? I worked in Dallas. McAllister's 2.5 hours away. I still had a job to do. Now, I had really cut way back on my hours because Debbie needed me more than my employer needed me. And I was performing a balancing act. Because that's what it takes to care for someone that you love, as I did with my father, and to a very small degree with Larry. I get to McAllister, I'm there with the doctors, and all he says is, whatever you're going to do, you got to do it now. And he was suggesting MD Anderson down in Houston. Well, this is the one part of a caregiver that I wasn't prepared for, and I guess if I had to do it again, I would know better to get a power of attorney for medical decisions. Her parents weren't agreeing. They weren't signing on, and I was telling them after I met with the doctor and saw in his eyes the same thing I saw in my dad's eyes. I could not get them to understand, your daughter is dying. I can't do anything about this. I guess I could have forced her, but I don't know. There's a lot of things I probably could have done different, but at the time, since I hadn't been faced with it, as most of us haven't, when you have a single parent, what could you have done different? I was hoping her parents would take the reins and say, daughter, you got to go here. I couldn't force her to go, and if I did, then what do you do with the girls? Do they stay with their dad? Do they stay with their parents? There would have been a lot of logistics to have worked out. Well, her father finally agreed, well, maybe I should call MD Anderson. And it's like, well, yeah, I think so. Debbie would pass on July 20th, 2009. And one of the hardest parts of her last few days was she became septic. I woke up in the morning. I didn't wake up. Her daughter woke me up saying, Mom's fallen and we can't get her up. This is what the cancer had done. Not only had it taken her down, not only had it sapped her energy, now the infection's in her brain. Can you imagine being in a hospital room with the one you love and they don't recognize you? They don't recognize their own children? This is, I was not prepared for, but since I knew it wasn't her, it didn't tear me up. Her oldest daughter, it did. She couldn't believe it. Cancer changes us in a way that we'll never completely understand. But if you get thrust into this role of caregiver, embrace it. Make sure you have a plan. How are you going to care for them? Who's going to help? What needs to be done? Because these were things that I didn't have any inclination, even though I'm a project manager in construction where everything is pretty well laid out and have a battle plan. When it comes to cancer, get it planned together. How are you going to take care of this person? Are you physically capable of doing it? Are you mentally prepared to do this? Because if you aren't, then you've got to get someone else to come in and help, because it is the most rewarding thing I have ever done in my life, but is also the most physically and mentally draining activity you will go through as a caregiver. And it's going to test you. And it'll test you every day. But the reward is phenomenal. Would I do it again? Yes, I would. Even knowing the result, that I would still lose my partner, my father, and Debbie. But because I was able to be with them, as you might be with one of your loved ones, those memories will never disappear. They get burned into your brain, and when you least expect it, those images will appear out of the blue, and they'll put a smile on your face, because you will know in the end you did everything you could for them. And that's what it's like to take care of someone dying of cancer.